Hey everyone, it's Big Jim here, Big Jim's Records. Going to give you a little crash course on record collecting because I realize there's a lot of terms or a lot of phrases you're probably not familiar with if you're not very involved with record collecting, if you haven't been collecting for a while. So I'll go through some different stuff, show you some different things. Um, Now, with records, they make limited edition packages all the time. And a limited edition just means that, whatever that pressing was they only made one batch and then that's it. Now, sometimes you had back in the 70s, like I think it was the Heart picture disc was, limited edition, numbered edition of 900,000 copies or something like that. Basically, it was limited to as many as they could sell. It's smart. It's a limited edition. It gets people interested in it and they want to buy it. It makes the collector and everyone say, "Ooh, hey." But I mean, limited editions could be everything from a different colored vinyl, maybe something different inside a poster. It could be all manner of things. It could mean everything up to, something like this, where it's a limited edition and it's a steel cover. It's made of steel. The thing weighs like 15 pounds. So I mean, you get some crazy limited edition weird stuff like that. That's kind of neat, you know. You're going to hear me talk a lot about import albums too, because in a lot of countries, especially in the 60s, countries would basically, whatever company was putting it out was responsible for making their own record cover. So you would have different album covers from country to country. Sometimes they'd be the same, but sometimes they would be totally different. Like here's a example of one, having a rave up with the Yardbirds. This is the Canadian version as it came out on Capitol Records back then. And so that cover is kind of cool, and it's collected around the world. And also, it's something to remember too is that, like especially in the '60s, they would make albums of different bands from different countries, and a lot of times there wouldn't be a big number of people in that country looking to buy that record. But say like you had the countries that were under the control of the English government in the 60s. In those countries where, it was, the English were the boss, the English records would come out. They would make very small batches of them, So, I mean, there are Beatle records from Iran. There's records from all these, I think I have one in here that's, where's this one from? I'll show you when I get to it. There's just some strange countries, and they would make very small editions back then because there was only maybe a few hundred people that would buy them. So they would maybe only make 500 or maybe only make 1,000 or a couple thousand. It depends. Sometimes, records would get on the charts in these other countries, these exotic, strange lands, and they would have a hit and they would make it, they would be special. But then, like, you would just have little differences. Like in England, this is actually I don't know what country this is from. Oh, this is from Turkey. But it was the original cover for the My Generation album from The Who. In '65, this was the cover that came out in most countries. But in the U.S., they had their own cover. They had this one. So it was, kind of, you would have different album covers. So you have like the people who collect the different issues of records that they love, so they would want to get, first pressings or different covers or different weird things from odd countries. And that would be the kind of stuff like this, like a Turkish My Generation. That's pretty damn rare, and that's a '65 issue. It's on the old Decca label. And so, I mean, things like that were kind of neat. It was different. And so, I mean, that's a realm of record collecting. Another realm is just the people who want the music. And they want to have, every song that they love, and that's what they collect. So, you'll get people who just want to have, they don't care if it's a reissue, an import, or whatever, or a bootleg. They just want to have that song on a record to play. And that's the other side of record collecting. So you have record collectors, but you even have totally different record collectors. Like there are some people who would say, "Why do you have 5 copies of My Generation? You only need one," which is kind of true. But I mean, if you like all those weird little odd things like that, they're kind of cool. It's kind of interesting field within record collecting, and it's actually very. It used to be more popular, more common to have collectors that would collect for the different packaging, the different covers and whatnot. Now it seems like it's more, the music collectors. They want but of course, even with the music collectors, they would want sometimes the first pressing. And I'm going to talk about that in a second with promos too. What's the big deal about them? The first, when they make a record, it's cut it's basically a mold, and it's pressed from the mold to make the record. Now you're only going to get so many strikes. You're only going to make so many records per mold, and then you have to replace it. And unfortunately, a lot of times record companies were not too cautious when they would recut these molds. They would just say, we'll make a copy from the last mold. And then you have a drop in quality, the sound quality. So getting an early pressing is really the best way of guaranteeing that you're getting the best quality, in theory, sound of out of that record, is by having a first pressing. And I know that in the U.S. especially, the promo copies that would be made, they would make special promotional copies for radio and review and whatnot. And they would make special promotional labels, white labels, because they wanted to differentiate between the copies that were out on the market being sold and the ones that were being given away for free. Because the distributors did not want to have people returning records that were sent out for free, and then they get something that, they didn't pay for. So that, originally it was white label, and then it got to the saw cutting, which I'll show you again as well. Another weird kind of odd thing with the imports too. You'll hear a lot of conversation talk about record club issues from like the 60s into the early 70s. And they went on into the 80s as well, and we had the Columbia House over here, and we had the RCA record club as well in the U.S. Record club issues sometimes are quite different because I know, like with the U.S. Capitol Record Club, the issue of Yesterday and Today has, I think it's 2 songs which are in true stereo. For some reason, the true stereo version only ended up on the Record Club issue with the green label. Go figure. So if you wanted to have, to hear the whole album in true stereo, because sometimes they would just throw these stereo mixes together too, because a lot of the records were mastered back then in mono, just because that was that was how the artist worked from you. You worked from a mono mix, or maybe you mixed it for stereo. But like in the question of like mid 60s, well, they would mix to mono, and so they would have to remaster it to get it into stereo. And it wasn't always something that like the Beatles sat there and monitored the stereo mixes. No, they really weren't there for that. As you read in the Bruce Spicer books, which are if you're interested in the recording sessions and the different records of the Beatles, the U.S. issues, those Bruce Spicer books are absolutely, hands down, amazing. But it's like reading a textbook sometimes, because it's just, there's so much information. It's so dense. But it's a tremendous tool to have. But I mean, he talked in there about how the Beatles weren't even present for the stereo mixes. Maybe George Martin would be there. But sometimes it was just the engineer, Jeff Emmerich, who would just be there to do the stereo. So he was the one that decided what mixes, what went into what channels. So sometimes, but anyway, back to record clubs. In Europe, they had record clubs also. And the record club, I guess, throughout a lot of the European countries was like the TV guide. It was the paper, the publication that came into every home in the country. Everyone had to see what TV shows are on. And in there, they would make their own records. They would license it from the record labels, and they would make their own pressings, and they would sell them. And what they would do sometimes is that they would put unique covers on them. I'm sure some of it was to try to trick people into getting their issue. Sometimes the record covers were pretty damn cool. They were pretty amazing. Like, this is a really nice one. This is for the Black Sabbath album, Paranoid. I think this is Holland or Germany. I can't remember exactly. It's one of those countries. One of those, colder European countries. And they made a special, I'll show it to you without in the sleeve. It's really beautiful. They did a nice job on it where they mixed the two album covers together. Song-wise, it's basically just the Paranoid album. But they rehashed it with the first album cover photo for some reason. It looks kind of cool, kind of weird, psychedelic, almost. Black Sabbath only had a couple. They didn't have too many back in the day of record club issues that were different. Here's a couple other club records that are interesting. Again, Beatle references. Now, the Magical Mystery Tour album was not released on record, on album, in most countries. It was released as a double EP. And the U.S. import, in the U.S. it was released on album. So people were buying up the import, of Magical Mystery Tour in these other countries quite a bit. Well, in Australia, for the World Record Club, they made their own special cover for Magical Mystery Tour, and it's a great cover. Great cover, it's nice packaging. They did sometimes you get some really nice looking covers like that. This is another one. This is a German one. A German record club. It was a compilation album of Beatles songs called The World's Best. Again, a great psychedelic cover. It's got more photos on the back. It's kind of neat. Song-wise, it's just a collection from 64, 65, it's just basically a collection of songs that they would put together. So, in that way, it was kind of a unique album, and so the record club issues, there are a lot of people who collect those. And for a long time, they really weren't collected much in Europe. And now it's really exploded. Or even over there, the prices have really gone up on a lot of stuff. And a lot of those records, too, like like people would say, oh, I remember seeing that at a flea market. Well, what would happen is that these companies would make these, special record club issues. And then when they stopped selling them and they had leftovers, they would end up sending them to America. Because the import business, import-export, was very big in records. Records are always being sent back and forth to countries. So it was possible to buy some of these odd imports in the United States and vice versa. They would get some of these the U.S. issues of the albums, like the U.S. albums that didn't come out over in Europe, things like the early Beatles, Beatles 65, Beatles 6, those were records that Capitol basically put together, that they Frankenstein together, basically, because back in the 60s, people bought singles and they bought the albums. So the rule was with a lot of groups is that you didn't put your singles on the albums because then you're making them pay twice. But unfortunately, when the singles would fall out of print, when albums started becoming more popular, these singles became hard to get all of a sudden. And you had to go track them down. You had to go find them. And sometimes that was not easy. And I mean, there's some early bootlegs, especially like of The Who had a lot of 45s and B-sides that those songs did not make it onto an album, it's kind of tricky, where if you want to have, Anytime You Want Me, well, you had to go track down a compilation album or a bootleg that had that song on it, because good luck trying to find the 45, because it probably only sold a few hundred copies. It was probably a dud seller. So, the 45 was hard to get. And that's where a lot of 45 collecting comes from, too, because the 45s, once they were the king, and then they kind of waned out, and then the album became the king seller. And, a lot of people said, well, I want the 45, I want how it originally came out. So they'll grab something like that. Here's another great example of a record that, just came out in another country with a completely different cover. The MC5, Kick Out the Jams. This is the Italian issue, the original first printing. And they did their own, they took the inside of the album cover and made that the front cover. Pretty cool. And then on the inside, kind of cheap, they left this entire thing open and they just put the regular album cover there. But it was a small label. It was Vetta Records. Not a big company, I don't think even in Italy at any time. So, sometimes these records would come out on small labels, in these other countries. And those are pretty tough to get because they came out over there. They were a dud. They didn't sell. And, the company went out of business and, good luck trying to find that album. Like I had never even seen this record cover until I bought a copy of it. So it was, it's kind of exciting when you find some weird, odd things. And a lot of times also in these other countries, like when they would issue records on their own with their own artwork, after a while, the parent record companies would say, no, you have to use our artwork because people are getting confused and they're buying multiple copies when they don't want to and they're complaining. And, well, we'd rather have them buy our version than yours. So, after a while, they had to stop doing it and they had to go back to, I want to finish that later, and they had to go back to using the regular album cover as it was. So, like here's one. This was an album that originally only came out in South Africa. But South Africa was bordered on Rhodesia, which isn't there anymore. And they made Rhodesian pressings. Now, the only way you could tell the difference between the South African and the Rhodesian pressing is in the matrix of the record, in the dead groove. There's a stamp in there with lettering that says Made in Rhodesia. But, I mean, they took the second album design that Capitol done, and they made Big Beat of the Beatles. Hey, the big beat's going on. So, so that's it's a whole world of the import stuff. And, I mean, I'm going to be looking at a lot of picture sleeves, too, because most 45s that came out over in Europe through the 60s into the 70s and into the 80s and 90s, they always had picture sleeves, whereas the U.S. didn't do that. The U.S. would only do that on records it was really pushing. The record companies didn't want to spend the extra money. They cheaped out. Like even the, one of the more in-demand Beatle records of all time, Can't Buy Me Love, it's the same picture as on the I Want to Hold Your Hand sleeve. And the reason that the sleeve is so hard to get is because they got pre-orders for 1 million copies. And Capitol said, it's already a monster hit. We don't need to make a picture sleeve to sell it. It's selling itself. So they only made a small batch with that picture sleeve, and then they scrapped the rest of them. They didn't want to pay for them to get done. And that's why that sleeve is so rare, is because they did not make many of them. And I think they were mainly sold on the East Coast. There's probably West Coast versions of the sleeve too, but most of the ones I've ever come across are the East Coast, which Capitol Records is straight across the seam at the top of the sleeve, where if you see like a little indentation, like a little place where you can grab the record, that's West Coast, usually the rule of thumb. That's how you can tell the difference quick between those two. I get a lot of people asking me about cutouts. What's the deal with cutouts? Cutouts basically were a way of the record companies identifying a record that was not sold for full price, for full regular price. It was either sent out as a promo or it was sold cheap to record stores because there used to be, the record stores would always have the cutout section, it was called. Basically, what it was the records that were all had little cuts in them, and they were discounted by the main record label because it was no longer, the biggest selling song. It was no longer the biggest selling album. It was off the rotation, so they just wanted to get rid of what they had. They cut them, they sold them cheap, and then they get out into the stores for less money. Whereas when I was young, most records were $7.50 when they brand new sealed. But the cutout, if you found their cutout section, you may find a store that had $1.99, $2.99, and sometimes you'd find some really good records in there. It's just there's nothing wrong with them, but the record companies would make more than they needed. That was always the rule of thumb when you had a record label is you made more than you needed because you wanted to make sure you had enough for every sale. And so they would sometimes make these huge pressings, and they would have tons and tons of copies left over. And if you ever saw that, there was that HBO show. I can't remember what it was called. It took place in the 70s. It was only on for one season, and they talked about, they had a conversation where the guy from the record store was like, I got 20,000 copies of your record in my basement. I got to get rid of them. Let me sell them. Let me do something with them. And that was the little tricks that the record companies would pull where they would just say, oh, we sold 20,000 copies, ship them to someone's house, and then they would just return them, or someone's store, I should say, not someone's house. They would return them when it didn't sell, and then they could sell them for cheaper money. And, there used to be stores in New York City that were built around selling cutouts because, there were so many, and there was a good record, so people still wanted them. So what does a cutout mean? A cutout basically means it was either a promotional copy or it was a discounted copy. It's really more of a way of, back when distributors would take returns on records, now they don't take anything back. So if you get a record and it's defective, you're kind of screwed unless whoever you bought it from decides they want to be nice and give you your money back or give you another copy because they can't return them anymore. But back then, the returning records was very common, and they would not take back anything that had a saw cut in it. Like this here is a saw cut. This is probably the most common form of a cut. You see that there, that little slice there? Basically, that's all it is. It's just a little saw cut. It's just drilled quick, just to make the point to say, yes, it's different. Like this one happens to be a promotional copy. Back in the, going back to the 40s and the 50s and 60s, they usually used to make promotional label copies. They used to differentiate completely so that, the promo copies couldn't get returned. And those were the ones that were sent out for free. But it got to be that was just costing them more money, so the record company stopped doing it. And then they just started using like a stamp, something generic that they would just stamp on the record, and that would say promotional. But see, like in this case here, this record, it's just a regular stock copy of the album. There's nothing special about the label. Do people pay more for promos? They used to quite a bit. Because you'd have people that say, well, I got the stock copy, now I want a promo. I want the one that was sent out to, promote this album. So they would seek out the promo, and then, you pay a few bucks more probably. And, it's just, again, the collecting mentality. Like here's an example of the white label that they used to have. I think you can see that. Where basically it's just the Elektra label, but just with a all white background, and usually it's like on that one it says for promotion only, not for sale. And people say, well, what's the big deal about white label promo? Well, basically it was money. Back in the old days, when you had color on your labels or your covers, whatever, it cost more money. to have that printed. So black and white, a white label with black print was the cheapest way to go to making. So that's why they didn't want to spend a lot of money for promotional. After a while, the record company started saying, well, maybe we'll make them pink or we'll make them red, or, they would just try to do something different to make their record stand out, because the whole point of promotional is that it gets the attention of the DJ to play it, and it gets the attention of the reviewer to want to review it. So, they would do things like that. Like this, in the 80s too, they used to put this sticker on a lot of the Warner Brothers family, press on high quality audiophile vinyl. Well, is it any different than the other vinyl? No, it's not actually. But they just put it on there because they wanted to make it seem like it was something special. And it worked. It worked. And then you have promotional records that are made only for radio or reviewers, and they're never actually made for the general public. And those are, it's more of like that's a radio aid. Like sometimes you would have some songs that are not on the album. So when you heard your DJ play, we're going to hear a Rare Springsteen live cut now, and they would play it, chances are it was from a promotional record that was mailed to them from the record company, and it made them sound like they had something exclusive, something special. Or, you had a sampler album. Say they, usually like they would make promotional samplers when they wanted the DJ to go back into that group's catalog or that artist's catalog and play more of the old stuff. Because, building a catalog, having, an artist where you're playing hits from 10 albums, well, there's a lot more money to be made with the publishing and whatnot and selling the back catalog than if you're just pushing one record. So, that's what that was about. But this is a promotional aid. This was from when The Who had the Face Dances album. They made an interview record. And basically, it was a do-it-yourself. They would include a cue sheet in there where the DJ would ask the question, and then you would play track 1, side 1, and it would have Pete Townsend answering you. So it sounded like the DJ was doing an interview with The Who, even though that was not the case. Because everyone would want to talk to a band, especially like The Who, and do something. So this is a 2 LP interview set. It's called Filling in the Gaps. It was done for the Face Dances album back then by Warner Brothers. And I remember when this first came out, it was selling for $50, $75. You'd even see them as high as. Now you see them for much less because they actually did make quite a lot of those. And they really wanted to promote The Who. That was their big group. And, that was a big time for them too, because that was when they were starting to think about winding down and doing their farewell tours and doing the, Shea Stadium shows. That's really when The Who broke into the big arena level where it became normal. Like you never saw The Who in an indoor venue ever again. Practically, you only see them at a stadium. So. It's the record company's way of trying to get the word out more, trying to get you to play the stuff. And then the next thing I have to show you with promotional is they would sometimes, where they would make, back in the old days, they would make a promo 45 and that was the hit. Well, the 45s and the LPs would get kind of mixed up, and the 45s would get lost in between and get misplaced. So they started making singles as 12-inch records, like a 12-inch single. Like this is an English promotional 12-inch for Twice as Hard from the Black Crowes, back from 90. Back from 90, I think. That's what my eyes see, yeah. And this is from England. And basically it was a way of saying, well, play the hit. This is the hit, play it. Pay attention to it. And you would get, sometimes they would release a 12-inch promo for every song, that was a hit, because they wanted radio to pay it, and that would be the song that, like, the music director would put out so that the DJs would say, okay, we're going to play this song over and over again. So this is what we're going to play a lot of. So that's where the 12-inch single came in. Right now, 12-inch promo singles are really not as collected as they used to be. They used to be very collectible. And there used to be people all over the place spending lots of money to get them. There's still some groups that still, fetch good money for their promo 12 inches, but not as many. Not as many. And then the last little thing I want to cover on is the bootleg market. Now, the bootleg market, a bootleg basically is any record that's made without the authority, without the group or the record label, the copyright owner getting paid for doing the record. It's technically illegal. So it's kind of a gray area. But unfortunately, with music people, those bootlegs were very desired because a lot of times, you would hear stuff that you would never hear anywhere else. And they started back in the 70s in earnest. People say that the first rock bootleg was Bob Dylan, the Great White Demos. His early stuff. They made a 5 LP set of them. But bootlegs have been, on the market for forever. And sometimes the bootlegs even get into the mainstream market. You'll have time. There have been times in the past where, like, a record, because of something contractually is going on, it'll have to go out of print, and then you have people bootlegging it and making copies on the market. That happened with the Let It Be album from the Beatles, because there was trouble between Capitol and Apple, and they were trying to get it resolved. So when it was still considered a new album, it vanished. You couldn't get, the regular copies of it made by Apple Records because of this contractual, because of the legal stuff that's going on in the courts. So some guys just made a bad copy of it. It's a little fuzzier. You could tell by looking at it. You look in the run-out groove, the matrix of the record. It should have a stamp that says Bell Sound. Like the written out. So it was an actual stamp. And if it doesn't have that, it's the boot. So, there are people who even collect those. But I mean, back in the 70s, boots would come out and they would just have insert front covers just shoved in there. And like this one's for Gentle Giant. I'd never seen a Gentle Giant bootleg. This was put out by Tarkle. It was a big company in the 70s. And some of the, it's funny, some of these bootleg record labels became quite legendary, trademark of quality. They made so many records and were issuing them all over the place, because back when these were coming out, no one really knew how to police it. No one knew how to stop it. So they had to put laws on the books to control it. So, you could get in trouble technically if you had these. Not too much trouble, because there are billions of them out there. But, you look at like what a 70s boot is, looks like, and then like what the new bootlegs look like, where they're just, incredible quality. Like this is the Tool, the last album, gorgeous colored vinyl. It's a nice full color cover with the image from the album. And stuff on the inside. And I mean, quite honestly, the sound quality has grown light years, because back in the old days, you get some of these bootlegs and you listen to them and they're like, you can't even hear what's going on. You can't even hear what the hell is playing. You can make out something faintly in the background, but you just can't tell. And, whereas now, there's FM broadcasts and, with the internet, it's opened it up so that now everyone knows what things sound good and what things sound like crap. So I guess the bootleggers learned, and now they're only, most bootleg live albums are FM broadcasts. They were live on radio. And another weird thing too, again, with bootlegs in like with this Tool, that was never released on record. So bootleggers in Europe went to town and they started issuing them, and they made picture discs, and they made, and I mean, even the bootlegs were selling for a lot of money there for a while there. It was kind of crazy. It's still a little crazy. But it's funny to me how a lot of the new bootlegs coming out are basically just regular stock albums. They're just making copies of albums that were released. Maybe they're out of print now. Sometimes they're still in print, but they'll do like special colored vinyls or something different. And those have become very, very popular with people. Do I think it's worth collecting? Well, it's a boot. It's not. It's not the real thing. But then there are some people who appreciate it more because it's not the real thing. It's really up to you. And there's a lot to choose from. It's crazy. But I mean, I'm going to talk about a lot of other things, a lot of different. I want to try to talk more. This show is going to be a lot about the people who've been collecting for a while and know the terminology. If I say, well, a single-sided test pressing, well, the collector is going to know what I'm talking about. But someone who doesn't say single-sided test pressing, what's that? And just be confused. But I mean, I'm going to talk about the different items and why they were made and how they were made and how they were distributed, and just to give you an idea of what is, because with record collecting, it's like anything else that you're collecting. The information is the key. Knowing this stuff is the most important, because you have to know what you're buying. You have to know what you're getting. And that's what I hope we share, And also I wanted to say, I didn't say in the last show, I want to do an interactive thing where people ask questions. If you have a question, what you do is go to Facebook and like Big Jim's Records, the page for the store, or the podcast, whichever. There's a Big Jim's, I think it's Big Jim's Podcast, it's called. They have a Facebook page. You could like that too. And if you have a question, private message us through there. And what we'll do is that before I do a show, I'll have a look at that and try to answer, any interesting questions that may be. If you say something stupid, I probably won't talk about it, but, that's okay. I'm a moody guy. I only talk about what I'm in the mood to talk about. So we're going to have a lot of, hopefully a lot of you are going to get turned on to a lot of cool stuff that you didn't know about before. And I'm not just going to be talking about the different pressings of common records. I'm going to be talking about records to go out and find just because you're probably missing something kind of cool by not having it in your collection. So I'm going to have, stuff like that I talk a lot about. And also another thing too is if there's, you have a record that you put out yourself and you want a little publicity, send us a copy. And if we like it, we'll talk about it on the podcast. We'll show it to people and probably even give you a plug of where they can order it from. Because, a lot of this stuff's kind of hard to find. If you don't get it direct from the source, you don't get it. So we're gonna talk about stuff like that too. We'll do like some reviewing of new releases, and maybe not so new releases, and just stuff that you probably should know about. Because you know about all the big stuff, and you could easily look stuff up on whatever you look up things on your little phone there, to figure out what's what. There's a lot of information out there. Well, I'm just another source of information. So we're going to do some more stuff like that. We're going to have some fun. But we'll be right back.